Hello and welcome to Summerlin Church. I'm Peter By. Bart Tarman will be along in just a moment to continue his series on healing and transformation. This message entitled Healing, Rejection and Condemnation. Rob Hodges and Kathleen Sieck will be along with another beautiful song of the season, this one based on a Gregorian chant which may have first been performed over 1,000 years ago. In Latin, it's titled Ubi Caritas, where charity is. Bart will return with an update on our $30,000 challenge grant, and Jenny Slaraw continues the story of the birth of the Christ child. This time, how God made the announcement not to the entire world, but to the shepherds in the nearby fields about the birth of his son. We've been lighting the Advent candles these past several weeks. On the first Sunday, we lit the candle of hope. On the second Sunday, the candle of peace. And today, on this third Sunday, we light the rose candle, the candle of joy. And we hear these words from Isaiah, chapter 35, verse 1. The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad. The desert shall rejoice and blossom. Like the crocus, it shall blossom abundantly and rejoice with joy and singing. You know, that makes me want to sing Joy to the World. We thank you for tuning in wherever you are in the world. And now, here's Bart with today's message, Healing, Rejection, and Condemnation.
Welcome to Summerlin Church. We're in the third Sunday of Advent, and here we are in our sanctuary again, which feels good. We welcome you to the sanctuary. Sad that you all can't be in it with me, but there'll come a day when we'll be able to do that again. Advent, as I mentioned last week, is we're in a waiting mode for the Advent, for the coming, for the manifestation of the Christ. And that's why we have our Advent candles here, and we have the third one lit. It's to symbolize the third week of our waiting until that beautiful Christmas morning when the Christ child shows up. And the message of Advent, as I said last week, and I will say again next week, is very simple, that we are waiting for a God who is with us in that baby Jesus Christ, and He is for us through that baby Jesus Christ. He's with us and He's for us. And that's why we wait with hope. I want to tell you a story that comes from a stage play by the title Orphans. And then a movie was made out of it that stars Albert Finney. It's only got 3 people in the entire cast. I talked last week about my friend Brennan Manning, and he's the one who told me about this movie. And he said it's rather profane. The language is very tough. But he said, I think it's probably the best telling of the gospel without doing it overtly that there is. And so I watched it with great anticipation, and he's right. The language is very rough because it's about 2 orphan boys in the middle of some urban setting who found an abandoned house, and their home lives must have been so terrible that just living in an abandoned house alone, these 2 boys, one probably in his late teens and one in his earlier teens, and they're trying to make ends meet by stealing and robbing, and one of them's clearly mentally disturbed, and both of them have clearly had violence in their background. And when you go inside this dilapidated house, it just makes you kind of cringe. It's filthy, it's unkempt, it's just a mess. But into this scene, oddly, walks a man, Albert Finney, great actor, and he is dressed to the nines with a double-breasted suit, a tie, a really nice handkerchief in his pocket, a hat, sharp, just looks incredibly sharp. And he walks into this dilapidated house. And you don't know what in the world is he doing here. And he's kind of looking over his shoulder a little bit, closes the door. And the rest of the story is about this dapper, highly skilled man with these completely dysfunctional orphans. And he calls them dead-end kids. He says, you guys are a couple of dead-end kids, aren't you? I know what a dead-end kid is. I was a dead-end kid. And he keeps using this phrase throughout the movie. And they're fighting him. They think he's weird. It turns out he's actually a gangster on the run. and yet he becomes the Christ figure in this movie. And at one point, they've literally got him tied up. He fell asleep, as I remember, and they tied him up. And he's kind of tied up like this. And he says, you guys are just a couple of dead-end kids. And the younger one, who seems more mentally disturbed, says, yeah, what's a dead-end kid? He says, yeah, you're a dead-end kid. I'm a dead-end kid. And you know what your problem is? You need a gentle, encouraging squeeze. And he's tied up like this with ropes. And he goes like this with his arm and says, come on over. I'll give you a gentle, encouraging squeeze. And that squeeze becomes the beginning of a healing process in these two boys' lives. And by the end of the story, the house is transformed, the boys are transformed. And I won't tell you what happens to Albert Finney's character, but it's a beautiful one. Dead-end kids, and all you need is a gentle, encouraging squeeze. Well, today we're looking at the healing from rejection and the healing from condemnation. And there's a lot of that in the life of Jesus. He heals people from invisible wounds, not just visible ones. He heals people that have been pushed to the margins, who've been oppressed. For example, the lepers. You remember many stories of him healing lepers. Lepers were like dead-end kids. They were pushed, literally, could only live with other lepers. They had to ring bells and hold signs, and they could only get so close to people, a little bit of social distancing, you might say, but it wasn't that everybody did, only they had to. And there was a social stigma that somehow they'd gotten this horrible disease through some sin of their own. And of course, Jesus changed that. So in one of the stories of a healing of a leper, the leper comes through the crowd. And you can imagine the crowd was moving out of the way, like you might if you knew somebody who'd been infected with COVID and was coughing, came through a crowd. The crowd would separate. And this leper in one of the stories crawls to Jesus on his knees and says, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. You can heal my leprosy. He had no doubt Jesus could heal it, but he did have a doubt that Jesus would want to heal it. And everybody listening, now from quite a distance, were thinking the same thing. Why would Jesus want to heal that guy, that rejected person who brought this disease on themselves? At least that was their theory, a completely wrong theory. And Jesus says instantly, of course I want to. See, unlike everyone else, he wasn't going to reject this person. In the presence of Jesus, you were in the presence of welcoming love, period. And then he touches the man, the very thing you would never do. And he does this in many of the stories. And that healing touch probably meant as much to the man as the cleansing of his leprosy. There was the time when they brought an adulteress to Jesus. She says she'd been caught in the very act of adultery. Jesus happened to be in the temple itself, in the center of Jerusalem. It'd be like being in a cathedral, St. Paul's Cathedral, and they drag in a person in this shame and their guilt and their embarrassment. And of course, you remember what happens. Jesus says, let he among you who's gone without sin cast the first stone, because they would stone someone caught in adultery. By the way, they were supposed to have both people there. They would stone these people to death. And Jesus looks around the crowd, and it's in the law that that's what they're supposed to do. And Jesus looks around and says, okay, I know what the law says, so the one among you who's gone without sin, pick up the first stone and throw it. And it says from the oldest to the youngest, they left until only Jesus and the woman were together. And she is down on the ground looking down. And he says, my dear lady, where are your accusers? She looks up, looks around. She can't believe it. She says, there are none, Lord. And he says, then neither do I condemn you. Now go and leave this life you've been living. Leave this life of sin. You see, she was in the presence of a welcoming love, and her self-condemnation and the condemnation of her community was healed by the presence of Jesus. I wish we knew what happened to her after that. We don't. Welcoming love. Where are your accusers? Welcoming love gets rid of the accusers. By the way, the name for the devil in the Bible is the accuser, Satan. It means the accuser. And you remember the time that Jesus found everybody thinks he was a short man named Zacchaeus. He was a tax collector. He was a dead-end kid, just like this adulteress was a dead-end kid, just like the lepers were dead-end kids. And they all needed a gentle, encouraging squeeze. Zacchaeus, it says, he climbed up in a tree so that he could see Jesus, for he was very short. I like to joke that it could be Jesus that was short. We're not clear if the he was Zacchaeus or Jesus. I kind of like the thought that Jesus was short, since I am. But at any rate, Zacchaeus is up in the tree. They're walking along. Zacchaeus is a complete outcast. He's a traitor to his country. He's extorting money from people for the Romans and for his own wealth. He's a wealthy man, but he's a hated man. And he's condemned by everybody, even more than a leper, even more than an adulteress. And Jesus sees him up in the tree. It's kind of a fun story. I think Jesus looks up and goes, what is Zacchaeus doing up in the tree? And remember, one of Jesus' own disciples was a tax collector, Matthew. And I'm guessing Matthew kind of went, hey, Jesus, look, there's Zacchaeus. I used to work with the guy. He's up in the tree up there. And Jesus stops at the tree, looks up, knows the guy's name, maybe through Matthew, I don't know. And he says, Zacchaeus, come down, because I have to be a guest in your house today. And Zacchaeus jumps down, and by the time he hits the ground, he says an amazing thing. He says, if I've extorted any money from anyone, I'll pay it back multiple times, and I'll give half my goods to the poor, something along those lines. I mean, he was a changed man. What changed him between being in the tree and hitting the ground with his feet? It was this welcoming love of Jesus, who said, I must be a guest in your house today. No one would go be a guest in his house except other traitors. Jesus' welcoming love was like a bath that washed away the shame, the guilt, the condemnation, and the rejection that he had experienced all his life. Last week I said, we need to open the aperture of our lives. Aperture lets in the light. There's plenty of light, and light dispels darkness, like in the painting I did of Advent. It's dark all around it, and there's light coming in, which is Advent. God is for us. God is with us, and the light is spreading. But we've got to open up the aperture, or today I'm going to say we need to dig a deeper channel in our own life to let that love flow in, and to let that love transform, and to let that love flow out. Now, what would those channels be? What are some things you could do this Advent season to create a deeper, wider channel for the welcoming love of God? Well, one thing you could do is pick one friend who you know is on the same spiritual journey you're on, and talk to them about it and say, how can we together open our hearts more widely to the love of God? Or as one author puts it, how can you put yourself in the place of least resistance to being overtaken by the love of God? That's really your work. How can you do that? Well, one thing, as I've mentioned many times, is to discover some spiritual practices that do that for you. That's what a spiritual practice does. It's meant to open our heart, open our mind, open our life to the reality of God's welcoming love, of God's powerful love that gets rid of the demons that we saw last week, of God's welcoming love that is a salve over our rejections and our pain. So what are some practices that you and another person, maybe you and your spouse, could find? I know Linda and I, we don't do this all the time, but we love a fire in the fireplace in the morning. If it's a little chill, we'll light a fire and we'll sit there together. And we'll just talk about spiritual things. We'll just talk about our life. We'll talk about how we're growing or not growing and what we can do about it. So find ways. It could be prayer. It could be discovering a new form of prayer. One that I've mentioned a number of times is called centering prayer. You can get a book on it. It's called Centering Prayer. We have it on our website. And it will teach you how to do a very simple form of what is called contemplative prayer. But don't let that word scare you. It just means that you're setting aside distractions to open yourself to the love of God. And there's some specific ways to do that in prayer. You can learn them. You can practice them. They may not work right at once. So when I started well, they kind of did. It was kind of exciting. And then it got a little hard and boring. And then as I persevered off and on, to be honest, but as time went on and that practice became more a part of my just way of being, it's one of the most important ones for me personally to open up the channel, to open up the aperture, and to let the light of God's advent come in so that I know that God is for me. I know that God is with me. And I know that God is in me, transforming me to allow God's own light of welcoming presence to come out through me to bring a welcoming love to others. And I hope you'll find ways to open your heart to that kind of healing for yourself and that kind of transformation in the circles of friends that you have.
Where charity and love are, God is there. Christ's love has gathered us into one. Let us rejoice and be pleased in Him. Let us fear and let us love the living God. And may we love each other with a sincere heart. Where charity and love are, God is there. As we are gathered into one body, beware lest we be divided in mind. Let evil impulses stop. Let controversy cease. And may Christ our God be in our midst. Where charity and love are, God is there. And may we with the saints also see thy face in glory, O Christ our God. The joy that is immense and good unto the ages through infinite ages. Amen. Ubi caritas et amor Deus ibi est, congregavit nos in unum Christi amor. Exultemus et in ipsum timeamus et amemus Deum vivum et ex corde diligamus nos in cielo.
ubi caritas et amor Deus ibi est, similur cum in unum congregamur, menos mente dividamur coemus, cesendi urgia malignum, cessent lites, et in medium nos visi Christis Deum. Ubi caritas et amor Deus ibi est, simulcumque cum beatis videamus, gloriander vultum tuum, Christe Deus, gaudium quod est immensum, atque probum, saecula per infinita, seculorum.
Thanks, Rob and Kathleen. We love your music, especially at this season. Thank you very, very much. I wanted to give you a quick update, maybe 1 minute here, on our financial situation at the end of the year. I mentioned last week that we have a $30,000 matching gift that has been given. And I said that we had $10,000 come in, and I was incorrect on that. That went into the general fund. But we now have $17,500 toward that $30,000 matching gift. So we're doing great. We're really thankful for all the generosity of every donor here at our church. And so we have $12,500 to close that gap. Give it some thought as you're thinking and praying at the year end here, and see if we can close that and end the year completely in the black. We appreciate everything you do, and God bless you at this time.